morning. This is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady. Let's talk today about combining our various needlework skills. Many of us who enjoy the knitting board also knit by hand and do other sorts of things, but today we'll talk about hand knitting combined with board knitting. There are some stitches that a hand knitter might find faster to do on needles than on the knitting board, or just like it more because it's smaller and you can do it in a different circumstance. For me, garter stitch is one of those stitches, so that's what I'm going to demonstrate. Some lace stitches and ribbing for some people might hit the same category. And you can combine the two things if you start with the stitch that you prefer to do on knitting needles. Complete the segment that needs that stitch. It might be a hem, for example. In this garter stitch example, it is a hem. And then move the stitches to the knitting board one by one. It's not very difficult to do. You start, of course, at the point of the knitting needle. Move each stitch that you're about to transfer to near the end of the point. Then pick it up with your loom knitting tool and drop it onto the nearest peg or needle on the knitting board. There are a couple of things to look out for. Here I'm knitting with Red Heart soft yarn, and that is not a very tightly spun yarn. So there's a little bit of a tendency for the yarn to split. You need to work slowly and avoid splits, and if you see one developing, work the tool back out and insert it anew so as to catch all of the strands. If you should drop a stitch during this process, it's really not a crisis. There's no great pressure on the fabric, so the stitch won't run. It'll just sit there and wait for you to pick it back up with either the point of the knitting needle or your loom hook, or if you need to use a crochet hook. If it does run down one row, you can simply re-knit it. It's not a big, huge deal. When the final stitch has been removed from the hand knitting needle and placed on the knitting board, you're ready to begin knitting in whatever stitch is next in the pattern. Keep in mind that the first stitch you hung will be where the working yarn is, and this only matters so that you can place the stitches on the board in such a way that you like the beginning point. The first stitch is where the beginning point for the next round or row will be. So consider that when you decide where to begin hanging your stitches. And that's pretty much it. Of course, you can reverse the process if you have some need to do so. You could be knitting on the knitting board and then remove the stitches onto a knitting needle and proceed from there. I hope this gives you some interesting ideas and you enjoy it. Happy knitting, and bye now. Whoops, here's a little PS for you. You will note that there is a yarn tail that I ignored and simply hung stitches over the top of it. This wasn't very obvious to me while I was working, but it shows up very well in the video. And lest you worry, this is not the working yarn. It is just a yarn tail. So if you do that, what I did, and let that get intermingled with what you're hanging, you will be able to just tug it out after the hanging is complete, which is what I did. However, if you got the working yarn involved and underneath the stitches that you hung, it would be a different story and a real pain in the neck. That you want to avoid. Okay, I'm really going now. Bye-bye.